So Franklin Richards first appears in Fantastic Four Annual, issue number 6 in 1968, and just from a reader's perspective, I really don't think this story is too well written, and the reason why is because there are some things that are left open. There are some questions that are simply not answered, and while the answers could have been given to us, they're simply not, and we just have to kind of accept them as being true. But what we see as the comic opens up is that Reed Richards is hard at work trying to find some way to save Susan Storm, and the reason for this is because Susan Storm is currently pregnant and she is approaching the hours in which she will begin to give birth. But the problem here is that the cosmic radiation that had given her, Reed Richards, Johnny Storm, and the Thing their respective powers is still a large part of her body. And because of this, it's entirely possible that this cosmic radiation could result in the death of both Susan Storm and the unborn baby. Now, we don't know why. We don't know why it would result in the death of either of these two individuals. We're simply just told that it will. And for the most part in this comic, we're not really given any resolution as to how that might happen. We simply just have to accept it and move on from there. What we see is that Reed Richards comes to the realization that the only way for him to save Susan Storm and the unborn baby is to capture an artifact from the negative zone. But what this artifact is something that we don't really know. Reed Richards simply says that he needs to gain antimatter, and antimatter, for whatever reason, will combat the cosmic radiation within the body of Susan Storm and presumably save both her and the unborn baby. But what we see going on here is that the Thing and Johnny Storm refuse to let Reed Richards go by himself due to the fact that the negative zone is such a dangerous place, and the last time that Reed Richards had mounted an incursion into the negative zone, it had almost got him killed. From here we see that Reed Richards, Johnny Storm, and the Thing, Ben Grimm, are in the negative zone. They've transitioned the barrier and are now attempting to find some method to cure Susan Storm of whatever ailment could presumably kill her and the unborn baby. But what we also see going on here is that the negative zone has been met by the arrival of Annihilus. Now, this is the first time that we actually see Annihilus in Marvel Comics. And Annihilus is, of course, the main villain, I guess, or the main protagonist in the Annihilation storyline. And all Annihilus really seeks to do is destroy everything. He really just seeks to eliminate all life. And that's what he's done so far in the negative zone. For a large majority of the negative zone, he's eradicated all life. And so for the most part, Annihilus and maybe a few forces are really the only people left. But what we see is that as Reed Richards and Johnny Storm make their way through the negative zone, they come across a portion of the negative zone which houses Annihilus and his cosmic control rod. And the cosmic control rod serves the purpose of granting its wielder virtual immortality, as well as the ability to manipulate objects or matter on the molecular scale. And what we see is that Reed Richards, Johnny Storm, and Ben Grimm, after a conflict between Annihilus' forces and themselves, they're able to capture the cosmic control rod and transport themselves back to the planet Earth. From here, we see that, of course, Susan Storm is able to give birth to the baby after Reed Richards had done whatever it was that he needed to do in order to ensure that she was able to give birth. And we see that Reed Richards is holding Franklin Richards, and this is the very first time that we will ever see Franklin Richards in Marvel Comics. Now, one thing I would like for you to keep in the back of your head is the discussion that we had in the first video, as the lead up to Franklin Richards, because these elements are going to become very important as we watch the progression of not just Marvel Comics, but Franklin Richards' character throughout the Marvel publication history up until the current date. So between Fantastic Four Annual issue number 6 in 1968 and Fantastic Four issue number 245, what we see going on here is that for the most part, Franklin Richards is simply a background character. There really isn't too much going on with him. He, of course, is, I guess, handed over to Agatha Harkness by the Fantastic Four, not in the sense that they give him away, but in the sense that they allow her to be somewhat of a caretaker for him, in the sense that she simply just monitors him, keeps an eye on him, and of course, due to the fact that he has the mutant ability to warp reality, that she's able to more or less try to keep him quelled. But at this point, Franklin Richards hasn't really demonstrated demonstrated the powers that he possesses. They flare up from time to time, but nothing of any real substance. But with Fantastic Four issue number 245, we see for the most part the first time in which Franklin Richards' powers swell up to such a degree that he makes himself a virtually omnipotent character. And what we see in Fantastic Four issue number 245 is that Susan Storm has been spending the day associating with a friend of hers. But when she arrives back to the Baxter building, what she sees is that for the most part, the building seems to be entirely empty, that no one really seems to be there. There's really no discussion, no talking, and the area really seems for the most part to be dead. She discovers the body of Reed Richards, but Reed Richards isn't dead. What's actually happened is that Reed Richards' mind appears to have been shut down, and Reed Richards is of course stretched out along a hallway, which really indicates that he had been fighting somebody or somehow been engaged in a conflict in such a way that it required the use of his powers. Susan Storm is continuing to investigate the Baxter building, and she comes across an individual, a tall blonde man, who is holding Johnny Storm by the neck. Now what's really interesting here is that this is the plasma form of Johnny Storm, which is physically the most powerful form that Johnny Storm has. Now this is not to be confused with Johnny Storm's Nova Blast. Johnny Storm does have a move called the Nova Blast, which in effect is a massive detonation that can destroy a multitude of different things. But the fact that this individual is able to hold Johnny Storm while Johnny Storm is in his plasma form, and this individual is sustaining no injury of any kind and is able to keep Johnny Storm from escaping, seems to be quite a incredible feat in and of itself. We see this individual talking to Johnny Storm, and what he tells Johnny Storm is that Johnny has the secrets to, or has the answer to whatever question it is this individual is looking for, and he begins to forcefully probe the mind of Johnny Storm. When he learns that Johnny Storm does not have the answers he seeks, he simply discards the unconscious body of Johnny Storm. From here, we see that Susan Storm, who has been invisible and watching this incident take place, is immediately detected by this blonde man. And again, this is simply another instance of this individual demonstrating how powerful he is. And the reason why is because, with the exception of telepaths of the highest order, or individuals who exist on a cosmic level and can detect changes in the, molecular area around them, not very many people can actually detect Susan Storm when she is invisible. When Susan Storm is detected, she immediately makes a run for it, and we see this blonde individual chasing after her. He tells her that she may have the answers that he seeks and that it's futile to attempt to get away. We see that as Susan Storm is running from room to room, that this individual is in effect remaking the walls of the building in order to allow him to pass through. And this is simply, again, another demonstration of the vast power that this individual has, that he can simply just alter the molecular structure of inanimate objects to suit his needs. We see that Susan Storm comes across the apartment of Ben Grimm, and the apartment appears to have suffered some sort of damage or some sort of violent action whereby an explosion appears to have taken place. In addition, she's unable to find Franklin Richards, who of course had been located in this area prior to her leaving the Baxter building earlier in the day, and so she begins to panic for fear of the fact that something may have happened to her son. From here, we see that ultimately Susan Storm comes into conflict. She is, for the most part, apprehended by this blonde individual, but that the remaining members of the Fantastic Four, whose conscious minds have been restored, come to her aid. And what we learn here is that this individual is in fact Franklin Richards, that Franklin Richards had been given a Rubik's Cube by Ben Grimm, and Ben Grimm had asked him if he could solve it. Franklin Richards, due to his youth and his inability to solve complex puzzles, was unable to solve the Rubik's Cube, so in response he simply just willed it to be solved. At that point he heard a voice on the television say, "When are you going to grow up?" And then subconsciously Franklin Richards transformed himself into a full-grown man. Now the other thing to bear in mind here is that while prior to this Franklin Richards had demonstrated subconsciously maybe a bit of his powers here and there, this is an instance whereby Franklin Richards has full possession of his abilities, and that while this individual is a child as far as his mind goes in the body of a grown man, he is still for the most part quite adept in being able to use his abilities. But what we see is that the last act of this individual before he reverts himself back into his childlike form after realizing what had happened is that he offers to transform Ben Grimm back into his previous state. And what had happened previously is that Reed Richards had attempted to find some way to make Ben Grimm human again. And Franklin Richards tells Ben Grimm that he can make him look human, and he begins to probe the mind of Ben Grimm. At that point, he telepathically says something to Reed Richards, and Reed Richards simply tells Franklin Richards, do whatever it is you feel you need to do. From here, we see what appears to be more or less a bright light, and then we see that Franklin Richards is back in his childlike state, and that Ben Grimm is back in his rocky state. We see that, of course, Ben Grimm asks Reed Richards why it was that he hadn't been transported or transformed back into a human again, and Reed Richards says that Franklin Richards was unable to do this, that he was not able to transform him back into his normal human self, that he had to transform him back into his previous state, whereby he hadn't been altered by Reed Richards. But what we see is that as Ben Grimm walks away with his blind girlfriend Alicia, that Susan Storm asks Reed Richards, isn't Franklin Richards able to do pretty much anything? And there was really no reason why he could not have set Ben Grimm back to being human again. Reed Richards replies that when Franklin Richards was talking to him telepathically, Franklin Richards discovered that Ben Grimm's biggest fear is that if he ever were to turn back into a human again, then Alicia, who is blind, would fall out of love with him because she's no longer the man that he knows. And so when Franklin Richards detected this, Franklin Richards wanted to ensure that Ben Grimm would stay happy, and so he gave him back his previous rock formation. Now, from this point going forward in the Marvel Comics, when it comes to Franklin Richards, I would again ask you to pay very close attention to the things that go on, to the things that happen, and I would like you to pay very close attention to the Fantastic Four as well, and other superheroes that come into contact with Franklin Richards. And again, if you will refer back to our discussion about the Silver and Golden Age of comics, I think that by this point you may have noticed something relatively interesting, something that I think is pretty pivotal and is really the root of one of the biggest questions in Marvel Comics. That question being, why is it that comic book characters don't age? So from Fantastic Four issue number 376 up until the Future Foundation storyline, Franklin Richards will play a very important role in a multitude of storylines, the most notable of which is the story of Onslaught. And during the story of Onslaught, what we had learned is that the frustration that Charles Xavier had been experiencing over humanity's refusal to peacefully coexist with mutants, and Magneto's hatred for humanity had combined into a very powerful psychic entity, and this entity was nigh unstoppable for quite some time, and especially so after it had absorbed the consciousness or the powers of Franklin Richards and Nate Gray, X-Men. But what we saw over the course of the Onslaught storyline was that through a combination of the actions of the Incredible Hulk, Bruce Banner, and the X-Men, the Avengers, and the Fantastic Four, and various other superheroes, that Onslaught was thwarted. But in the process, in order to ensure his defeat, virtually all of the non-mutant superheroes had jumped into the spiritual, or I guess the energy-based body of Onslaught, and were presumed to have been killed. But what we actually learned here was that the child version, Franklin Richards, had subconsciously brought them all back to life by creating a separate universe. And this universe was called the Heroes Reborn universe. And during this Heroes Reborn storyline, we're taught a few things, or told a few things by Marvel. One of the first things we learn is that this is a universe that was created by Franklin Richards, but it was done subconsciously. Franklin Richards didn't realize that he had actually done this. What we also learn is that the universe exists inside of a blue object about the size of a blue bowling ball that Franklin Richards carries with him everywhere he goes. Again, because this is subconscious, Franklin Richards doesn't understand what this blue ball is or what it means. He just simply knows that he needs to hold on to it. And in the Heroes Reborn storyline, we more or less get a reboot of sorts for the Marvel characters that supposedly died during the Onslaught storyline. But what we also see taking place is that a member of the Celestial Host appears to Franklin Richards in the form of a human, and tells Franklin Richards that because of his actions in creating the Heroes Reborn universe, that he has caught the attention of the Celestials, and the Celestials are arriving to force Franklin Richards to make a choice. Either Franklin Richards can choose to allow the Heroes Reborn universe to exist and destroy his own Earth-616 universe, or he can destroy the Heroes Reborn universe and keep the Earth 616 universe alive. And over the course of the Heroes Reborn storyline, what we learn is that Franklin Richards chooses to keep the Earth 616 universe. And so all the superheroes that were in existence or had been housed within the Heroes Reborn universe were brought back to the Earth 616 universe by Franklin Richards and then restored to their previous state. Now again, at this point, despite the fact that his actions are subconscious, Franklin Richards again demonstrates to us that he has powers that are virtually unrivaled by anybody within the Marvel Universe. But again, Franklin Richards makes a very big decision here, and I hope you've caught it, that Franklin Richards has in effect retconned Marvel superheroes, that he has adjusted the histories of Marvel superheroes. He has in effect changed their stories entirely. And what we will see as we move forward with this discussion, especially when we get into the Future Foundation, is that Franklin Richards will do this time and time again. But this is the power that's being demonstrated from the mind of a child. And what I would like you to do here is to compare Franklin Richards to the Marvel Comics community, that is to say, the writers and the artists at Marvel Comics, to a lot of the storylines that you've read in Marvel Comics, and to ask yourself this question: what similarity does Franklin Richards have with the storylines and the retconning events that go on in Marvel Comics? So the Future Foundation storyline of the Fantastic Four, which began in Fantastic Four issue number 579, is one of my favorite stories in the Fantastic Four. And the reason for this is because, for the most part, this will chronicle Reed Richards' attempt to solve everything. And Reed Richards will in fact encounter a group called the Council of Richards, which exists in this sort of nexus, that is to say, this in-between area where all universes meet. And the Council of Reed Richards, or the Council of Reeds as they call themselves, are a combination of multiple Reed Richards from multiple universes, and that each of these versions of Reed Richards varies from the other, in the sense that one version of Reed Richards has Johnny Storm's powers, one version of Reed Richards has Susan Storm's powers, another version of Reed Richards is a portal to all other universes. They vary depending on that universe, that scale of that universe, and what it was that resulted in Reed Richards becoming that way. But the intention of these multiple Reeds are to effectively solve all the problems in the Marvel multiverse, and their actions result in the attention of the group of Celestials from an alternate universe. And the Celestials from this universe have in effect grown mad. They've grown insane due to the fact that they've began to view themselves as the gods of that universe, and that they should not only be worshipped by the inhabitants of that universe, but they should be worshipped by inhabitants of all universes. What we see is that one of the versions of Reed Richards, which hails from this universe that has the mad version of the Celestials, had previously been kidnapped by the Celestials, and had had his mind read by the Celestials, at which points the Celestials learned about these Council of Reed Richards. When the Council of Reed Richards was invaded by the Celestials, the Reed Richards from the Earth 616 universe had fled. But what we had also learned is that of all these Reed Richards, that our version, the Earth 616 version of Reed Richards, is the only one who had refused to give up his family. Now, while this is taking place, we see that at the Baxter Building, while the Celestials are on their way, that an individual, a older blonde man, enters the Baxter Building undetected until the sensors begin to go off, and no one quite knows how he was able to enter. The Fantastic Four attempt to intercept him, but we see that he puts up a force field that is simply impenetrable by anybody. He speaks to Franklin Richards by virtue of more or less waking up his powers. And at the end, we see that what's going on here is that Franklin Richards is in fact under his blanket and is creating a universe in the palm of his hands. From this point, we fast forward over a series of events, and we end up at this conflict whereby the Mad Celestials have arrived on the planet Earth. We see that, of course, Reed Richards, for the most part, is able to summon Galactus, not directly, but simply by enticing Galactus to the planet Earth. Galactus encounters the Mad Celestials, and the Celestials combine themselves into one being and are able to swiftly thwart Galactus. At this point, Galactus is not necessarily dead. Galactus is simply just in a very weakened state due to the amount of energy that he's expended fighting the Celestials and is unable to continue any further. The Celestials then begin to split apart and, of course, begin to fight the Fantastic Four. And over the course of their conflict with the Fantastic Four, we see that virtually everybody is defeated with the exception of Susan Storm. And Susan Storm is able to, in effect, try to hold her own by blocking the attacks of the Celestials, but at the moment in which she is, in effect, going to be defeated and presumably killed, that the future adult versions of Franklin Richards and his sister Valeria Richards appear. Now, this is a really interesting part of the comic, and the reason why this is one of my favorite parts of the Future Foundation event is because this is when we see that Franklin Richards makes Galactus his herald. What we had learned from Nathaniel Richards, who is currently with the Fantastic Four, is that when Reed Richards had joined the Council of Reeds and when he had refused to abandon his family, that by virtue of being the only person who did that, he set forward a series of events that would result in Franklin Richards traveling into the past, because by refusing to abandon his family, he had begun to spend time with his family. He had begun to associate with his family and given his family the kind of attention and the kind of devotion that they were in desperate need of. By virtue of this, Franklin Richards has traveled into the past to try to keep Reed Richards from being killed by the Celestial host, which had happened in Franklin Richards' future. What we see is that when Franklin Richards of the future had spoken with his younger self prior to this conflict, that he had told his younger self to simply hold all the energy that he would gain over this time, that all the energy that he would normally use needs to simply be stored more or less, and that Franklin Richards would know what to do when the time came. At this point, Franklin Richards uses these energies to revive Galactus and then to supercharge Galactus's powers. When the Celestials arrive, they are greeted by both Franklin Richards and his herald Galactus. Over the course of the conflict, which is sheerly devastating in terms of the amount of destruction that's being wrought and simply just on a scale that virtually no one other than Galactus and Franklin Richards can possibly comprehend, that ultimately Franklin Richards is successful, although it's presumed that he had died. In reality, he had actually survived, and this survival is revealed to them by Galactus. And we see that for the most part, this version of Franklin Richards, as he is being shown to us, is an individual who is so astronomically powerful that he is in effect on par with the highest order of Celestials, the highest order of cosmic entities in the Marvel Universe, and is in effect, at this very moment, on the level of a god. So what we see going on here as we look at Franklin Richards and the bigger picture is that Franklin Richards represents Marvel on multiple levels. For one, Franklin Richards is a universal constant, meaning that because of the powers that he possesses, he is on par with some of the highest orders of cosmic entities in Marvel Comics. He is, in fact, the most powerful Earthbound superhero in Marvel Comics. But what we also see is that Franklin Richards is a comic book constant, meaning that he is a character that will always be part of the comic book scene. And the reason why is because Franklin Richards is, for the most part, a representation of Marvel Comics. He's a representation of what it means to be a writer or an editor. And the reason why is because what we see with Franklin Richards going on in comic books is that during the golden and silver age of comics, comic books followed the current trends. Comic books reflected the current time, the current events, and characters grew and characters got older. But then Franklin Richards came along and that stopped. Characters stopped getting older for the most part. The only characters that really grew when it came to Marvel Comics or really got older in terms of them just becoming older people were individuals that for the most part never really came into contact with Franklin Richards. And so for the most part, that is pretty much everybody in the Avengers. That is the Fantastic Four. That is a majority of the X-Men. And it's only the lesser known publications, or for the most part, the characters you don't see very often, that are the ones that grow older. Now, recent events, especially considering Original Sin and Nick Fury in Marvel Comics, have adjusted this. They have reflected the fact that this isn't 100% true. But what's really interesting here is that aside from the age of characters, aside from characters not growing older, Franklin Richards represents the establishment. He represents the status quo. And what I mean by this is in the example of Onslaught and the example of Abraxas, who of course was the result of Galactus being killed and an individual that jumped from universe to universe, killing various Galacti. Abraxas was destroyed by virtue of Franklin Richards restoring Galactus and Reed Richards using the Ultimate Nullifier. But this is a reflection of the status quo that Marvel maintains, that Marvel has a set standard when it comes to superheroes. Marvel has a set standard when it comes to storylines and groups, and that those will always be there. That when an event comes along that changes things irrevocably or could potentially change things irrevocably, that Franklin Richards comes along by virtue of the writers and editors at Marvel Comics and stops it. He sets things back to the way they were supposed to be. And this could be construed as a good or a bad thing. Some people may look at it and say this is an inherently bad thing because it does not allow characters to progress. We don't get to see other versions of the Fantastic Four. The Fantastic Four are always Susan Storm, Reed Richards, Johnny Storm, and The Thing. We don't get to see the next generation of the Fantastic Four. And they look at characters like Spider-Man, and they look at groups like the X-Men, and of course they see and continue to believe the same thing. And this, I would say, is the most important part of Franklin Richards when it comes to Marvel Comics, the fact that Franklin Richards as a child does not want to see the world change. And so the argument that's being produced here is that Franklin Richards, in effect, controls the Marvel Universe. The only people that age are the people that Franklin Richards is okay with aging. The only people who don't age are the ones that Franklin Richards doesn't want to lose over time. Franklin Richards likes the world the way it is, and so when a circumstance comes along that jeopardizes that, Franklin Richards changes things back. And this is a reflection of, again, the status quo that we've seen at Marvel Comics. We, of course, saw the Days of Future Past, we saw Heroes Reborn, Heroes Return, we saw a lot of these events take place in Marvel Comics, and over time the events were retconned, or almost immediately they were retconned, and the status quo was reinstated, and then things began again. And again, this is really interesting here because I think that a large portion of people look at Franklin Richards and they see him as simply just a child with an incredible amount of power, when in reality, while he may have that, he is much more than that because he represents Marvel Comics as a whole. He represents Marvel Comics ideologies as a whole, and he represents the fact that at the end of the day, that Marvel is very reluctant to move on from the status quo that's been presented to us, and that ever since 1968, that characters have for the most part never moved forward, never advanced, and that neither has Marvel Comics. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, let me know, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.